HIV is no longer the death sentence it once was, but it is still a very serious and communicable disease. Canada is a world leader in prosecuting people for not disclosing that they are HIV positive to sexual partners. Not everyone thinks that's a good thing. Joining us now for their insight, Richard Elliott, Executive Director of the Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network. Edwin Bernard, Global Coordinator for the HIV Justice Network, a global HIV information and advocacy NGO. And Otisha Massaquoi, Executive Director of the Women's Health in Women's Hands Community Health Center based in Toronto. Welcome to all three of you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Richard, I wanted to start with you. Let's start with the current legal context. What does Canadian law say about people living with HIV and their sexual partners?
So at the moment, Canadian law is amongst the widest in the world in terms of criminalizing people living with HIV.
What do you mean, like in the widest in scope?
Widest in scope. Okay. So what has most often happened as Canadian law has evolved is that people living with HIV who are accused of not disclosing their status to a sexual partner in a wide variety of circumstances have been charged with and prosecuted for an offense called aggravated sexual assault, which is one of the most serious offenses in our criminal code and carries some of the most serious penalties in the criminal code. Potentially life in prison and mandatory designation as a sex offender, presumptively for life. So it is one of the most serious charges, and we've seen the very widespread application of that particular provision of the criminal code to a whole range of circumstances, even when there has been no or exceedingly small risk of actually transmitting HIV. And one of our concerns has been that the law continues to expand, even as the science increasingly tells us that the law is out of step with what we know about the risks of transmission. And we've seen about 184 cases that we know of so far where people have been prosecuted in Canada. Wide range of circumstances, but as I say, many of them since 1989. Okay. And that actually gives us one of the highest numbers of prosecutions in the world and one of the highest per capita rates of prosecution of people living with HIV. So when you say we're a world leader in prosecuting people, that is unfortunately true. And that's the unfortunate reality facing people living with HIV in Canada now, because we have this very broad, and I would argue stigmatizing and unwarranted application of the criminal law in a vast array of circumstances that really don't deserve the attention of the criminal law.
I'm wondering, what role does intent play in the charges, I suppose?
So at the moment, under Canadian law, in fact, the prosecution does not need to prove that someone actually transmitted HIV to a sexual partner or that someone even had the intent to transmit HIV to a sexual partner. So this is how low the bar has been set in Canada. International recommendations have fairly consistently said that we should probably be limiting the use of the criminal law in these cases to those circumstances where there is actual transmission of the virus and where it is proved that the person intended to transmit the virus. And yet Canada has set the bar much, much lower, and that's why we have this very wide application of the criminal law that is really causing a lot of harm that I think we'll talk about more today.
Okay. And Edwin, when did countries begin prosecuting people for offenses relating to not disclosing their HIV status?
The first cases were around 87, 88. So, Canada was amongst the first in the world to do so. I think the very first case took place in Germany, very soon after that in the US military. And then the US started passing in a lot of HIV-specific criminal statutes, and prosecutions have ramped up since then.
And in Canada?
So I think prosecutions started really ramping up following the Currier's decision at the Supreme Court in 1998, which basically framed HIV non-disclosure as a sexual assault.
Are these laws just specific to HIV?
So in Canada, of course, you're using general laws, and actually quite a number of different laws have been applied and can be applied. And non-disclosure it's basically of something that's considered to be a serious communicable disease when there is a significant or now a realistic possibility, according to the 2012 Supreme Court ruling, of a risk of transmission. And so very rarely other sexually transmitted infections can be and have been prosecuted in Canada and have been, for example, in England and Wales and in Scotland, which have different laws applied, but because they're using general laws around grievous bodily harm or reckless endangerment, you can apply apply them to other sexually transmitted infections. However, HIV is by far the virus that is singled out, and that's because of the stigma of HIV.
We're going to talk more about the stigma, yeah?
In Canada, I mentioned there are about 184 cases of people with HIV being prosecuted for allegedly not disclosing their status. We're aware of maybe 5 or 6 prosecutions involving other sexually transmitted infections. So just that stark difference in numbers right there tells you this is really about singling out people living with HIV for this really intense scrutiny and punishment under the criminal justice system.
So if somebody has HIV, when are they expected to disclose that they have HIV? Like before they kiss somebody, or like when are they expected to do that?
So that's really one of the most important questions. And under Canadian law at the moment, as Edwin was mentioning, in the context of an important Supreme Court decision that happened about 5 years ago, the court said if there is a realistic possibility of transmitting HIV, then that's when there is a duty to disclose that arises. So it kind of depends on, in theory, on what the sexual act is. Now, on the face of it, that might not to many people sound like it's particularly problematic. You know, it says realistic possibility, that's when you have a duty to disclose. But even though the court actually said, what we're not trying to do here is actually criminalize people in those cases where there's an extremely small or speculative risk of transmission. There has to be a realistic possibility before you have a duty to disclose. In practice, what they then went on to do is actually apply it in ways that mean exceedingly small risks of transmission are still captured by the criminal law. And we see many, many prosecutions in which there's even no risk of transmitting HIV, and yet someone has been prosecuted for not disclosing. So on the one hand, you have the notion of the standard being set up here of a realistic possibility in theory. But how that's actually been playing out is really problematic. It's much, much broader than that. The bar has actually been set in practice much, much lower.
I want to get into some numbers. We have a couple of graphs to show you from Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network, your organization, Richard. The first one shows the yearly number of HIV-related criminal cases in Canada up to 2016. As you can see, there was a big spike in 2010, but they seem to have come down since then. How prevalent are these kinds of prosecutions, Richard?
Well, we see, as you've just pointed out, from year to year, we see anywhere between, half a dozen cases to 10 or 12 cases in a year. I think it is worth noting that more than half of those prosecutions have actually happened here in Ontario. And that's disproportionate compared to the number of people living with HIV in Ontario as opposed to other provinces in the country. And I think we should probably talk a little bit about why that is. But Ontario is really a hotspot of criminalizing people living with HIV.
We're going to get into the whys in a minute. And Natisha, I want to get you into the conversation. But I wanted to follow up with you, Richard. 200 cases over 17 years. It doesn't really seem like a lot of convictions. So why is this a big issue?
Well, it's a big issue for a couple of reasons. One, because many of these cases actually will attract a lot of media attention. Some of that has not been particularly well-informed media coverage. It leads then to further misinformation in the general public about HIV and what the perceived risks of transmission actually are. Mm-hmm. And there's already this exaggerated sense of how easy it is to transmit HIV that is driving these prosecutions in the first place. And this just kind of creates a feedback loop of, well, why would you be prosecuting this case if there weren't something really seriously wrong here, if there wasn't some serious harm done or some serious risk of harm? And yet, as I said, we see a very wide application of the law. That also casts a shadow over all people living with HIV who then live in fear of various sorts about how they might be accused. They might be one soured relationship away from actually being on the receiving end of an accusation that they didn't disclose, even if they had. And then we can get into a credibility contest of he said, she said, or he said, he said. That's a very real concern in the lives of people with HIV. And it creates another reason why people, quite understandably, would avoid seeking HIV testing, because you can't be prosecuted if there's no proof that you actually know that you have HIV, and there's some evidence to show that there is some of that negative effect. And when you look at actually who's being prosecuted and how that gets covered in the media, I think it's also worth noting that there are certain communities that have been disproportionately targeted by criminalization. If you look at the
we're going to get to that. We're going to get that to it. Yeah, right. Let's take a look at the numbers. Well, here's a breakdown of individuals charged based on race and ethnicity. And as you can see, 33% are white. 23% are Black, 6% are Indigenous. Latin American and Asian people make up 2% of cases each, and 34% are unknown. Natisha, why are Black Canadians disproportionately charged?
I mean, that's an interesting question, and I think it's really important to note that while Black Canadians are making up 23% of those charged, they're only making up 8% of the population. So it's grossly disproportionate. What we're seeing particularly is how HIV gets stigmatized and labeled as something that particular communities, particularly Black communities, are bringing to Canada. And when we look at the first case in terms of who was charged and how that got portrayed in the media, and we're looking at the Sanyonga case.
Charles Sanyonga?
Charles Sanyonga, who was the first person charged. He was a Ugandan immigrant, and the hysteria that the media played up in terms of a Black predatory immigrant who was bringing a particularly different African strain of HIV to Canada and was victimizing all of these women, it labeled a particular community, the Black community, in terms of how we perceived ourselves, how we then addressed HIV, and how we were yet again further stigmatized by something else in the Canadian society.
Charles actually was my uncle. We are not blood related, but he's somebody that I grew up with. He was a good friend of my parents, my dad and my stepmother. And my sister actually worked in his store because he had a store in London, Ontario. And I remember that story, that case coming out, because obviously he was part of the family. And I was really young, 11. Do you think because he was the first in Canada that kind of set a precedent?
It set the precedent in terms of who gets criminalized and how that community gets treated in terms of accessing services, how they're treated in terms of any kind of doubt that possibly could have been played out in that case didn't exist because of who he was, and particularly as a Black man, and how we often over-sexualize particular communities, particularly Black men.
Do we know how many, the percentage of Black men that have HIV?
I might turn to Richard on that.
I don't know the percentage off the top of my head, but we certainly do know, as Natisha has mentioned, that the representation of Black men amongst the men who have been charged, the total number of men who have been charged, is significantly disproportionate to the prevalence of HIV among Black men.
And as you mentioned too, those are the cases that get covered through the media.
And just one quick correction, the case that was mentioned wasn't quite the first prosecution, but it was certainly one of the first that was very high profile.
Charles Sanyonga? Yeah.
There had been a few before then, but that one certainly really stood out as attracting a lot of media attention. And I think it's worth noting that if you look at the media coverage, as some of our colleagues have done over the years, the media attention that arises in one of these cases when the accused person is a Black man is wildly out of sync with the actual percentage of people who are accused who are Black men. So it attracts way more media coverage when the accused is a Black man. And I think that also is something that we need to factor into how this plays out in people's lives and the perceptions that people have about this issue and of particular communities.
And Ed, when you're from the UK, we know media, the role that it plays in people's lives. Do you see that same thing unfolding overseas?
Yes, I think particularly where in countries where we have migrants coming from high prevalence countries, particularly from sub-Saharan Africa, often the very first prosecutions or the early prosecutions tend to be of heterosexual men from high prevalence countries that create the legal precedents. It was the case in England and Wales, it's been the case in Belgium, it was the case in France. And so, and there's this idea, of course, that all of the countries we're mentioning are generally considered to be low prevalence countries, or with concentrated epidemics primarily amongst gay men and other men who have sex with men. And there is this sort of moral panic that appears when it tends to be a white woman makes a complaint about the fact that they have either been exposed or infected by a man from a high prevalence country. Because they were never targeted with HIV prevention messaging as well. And that's part of the larger picture of how HIV prevention messaging plays a role in criminalization and actually reinforces some of the problems around criminalization and stigma. So it's really an issue that people who don't feel that they're at risk of HIV tend to be the ones who would consider themselves to be victims and therefore complain to the police.
And we were talking about this criminalization aspect here in Canada. I'm wondering, how is that, we spoke about some of the countries that, that now prosecute people for not disclosing their HIV status. How would that affect somebody in an African country?
Someone who's being prosecuted?
Yes, because I guess there's other countries in Africa that are criminalizing people who don't disclose HIV status.
Yes, there's a substantial number of countries around the world that have used the criminal law in one way or another, and that includes a certain number of African countries. Edwin is certainly the expert on the global scope of criminalization. But
how would that affect a mother who has HIV and then passes it on to her child unknowingly?
Well, yes, so there are 30 countries in sub-Saharan Africa that have HIV-specific criminal laws, and they've all been passed since 2000. Many of them were actually inspired and disseminated by US foreign policy, because the US is also a world leader there. And some of those laws actually did, and a couple of them still do, specifically criminalize the vertical transmission, the potential exposure of a child either during birth or breastfeeding. And there have been a number of cases, including very recently in Malawi, of a woman who actually accidentally breastfed another woman's child. It was a mix-up, and she was prosecuted for potentially exposing that infant. She was convicted at the lower court, but there was a global condemnation, and a network of advocates, including the Canadian HIV Legal Network, helped support with scientific information that actually showed that there was no risk of exposure, and she was ultimately found not guilty at the higher court. So women in sub-Saharan Africa are disproportionately prosecuted, not just around vertical transmission, but also just around sexual exposure transmission, because women are the first generally to know their status in a relationship because of antenatal testing. Women are engaged in healthcare, and it's pretty much mandatory for a pregnant woman to be tested for HIV. And the men tend not to be, or certainly a lot less engaged in healthcare. And the cases that we know about in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, the women are basically accused of bringing HIV into the relationship because they know their status first. And the men tend not to even have been tested. So there's real problems around evidence, of course, but there's this assumption that the first person to know their status is obviously the first, is the person who would have exposed or transmitted HIV, is a huge problem, and it's part of the work that we're doing globally with scientific experts to actually highlight the many ways that science is misunderstood in the criminal law. It's misunderstood here in Canada, and the 2012 Supreme Court ruling really got the science wrong and made a bad law worse.
Talking of this,
those implications for women are not just obviously in African countries.
Yeah.
I mean, Notisha and I were talking
Yeah,
about some of the things that her organization's clients
Yeah,
experience.
Notisha, does this issue affect women differently than men in Canada?
Most definitely it does. And just as Edwin pointed out, in Ontario in particular, all women are offered prenatal HIV testing. And so women often find out their HIV status at that point in time. So they're the first member of the family to find out that they're HIV positive. We also have a situation where immigrant and refugee women are finding out their HIV status because we're testing immigrants during their immigration medical, and then people are finding out about their HIV status. So you have two populations that are intersecting: immigrant and refugees, as well as women who are finding out their HIV status during prenatal testing. What ends up happening is a particular level of vulnerability that women find themselves in terms of HIV, being accused of bringing HIV into the family. And we also, because of gender-based violence, see that women who've been sexually assaulted are 4 times more likely to contract HIV. So we have another factor coming into play as well. And then women who are living with HIV also report a 40% higher rate of experiencing violence. And oftentimes after they find out they're HIV positive, it puts them at risk and vulnerability for violence, particularly if the relationship wasn't a conducive one to begin with. So we're seeing a lot of areas where women are finding themselves in extremely vulnerable positions. Mm-hmm. And then because of the level of stigma that we still have around people living with HIV, and particularly women living with HIV, how they are stigmatized and portrayed as promiscuous, as lacking control, doesn't take into account that women often don't have the ability to make decisions around practicing safer sex in relationships.
I was just going to say, if you come from a patriarchal society, it's really difficult to ask your partner to put on a condom.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We invited the Ministry of the Attorney General's office to participate, but they declined. They did send us a statement, and the statement says, prosecutions involving exposure to HIV are complex and engage a number of legal and scientific issues. On World AIDS Day 2016, the federal government announced its intention to review this area of law. The ministry applauded this announcement and is actively engaged in working with the federal government, along with the provinces and territories, affected communities, and medical professionals to examine the criminal justice system's response to non-disclosure of HIV status. What sentence do people often receive for these cases? Richard?
When you look at the available data we have about sentencing, the average sentence overall is somewhere in the realm of 4 years. Incarceration. That is actually substantially higher than the average sentences you see in other kinds of sexual assault cases. So remember, HIV non-disclosure is most often being treated
aggravated sexual assault
as a fraud. That means your partner's consent to sex wasn't legally valid, therefore you've committed a sexual assault. But it's not what I think most people normally think of or understand when we think of sexual assault, right? If you compare the HIV non-disclosure cases that have been prosecuted as sexual assault versus what we normally think of as sexual assault cases that involve coercion and violence and so on, then you see a higher conviction rate in the HIV cases than the non-HIV cases. You see a higher likelihood of a prison sentence being imposed, and you see longer sentences being imposed. Now, these are rough estimates, but the available data we have suggests that. And that, I think, also is a set of indicators that part of what's operating in this system here is that HIV stigma and that moral panic around HIV. If we're using one of the most serious tools in the criminal code, one of the harshest penalties that we have, and we're applying it in such a robust, vigorous way, when, as women's rights advocates have pointed out over and over again, so many complainants who have experienced what we normally understand as sexual assault, of coercion and violence and so on, are not getting that kind of support and reception and that robust prosecution from the criminal justice system. It seems like we have actually a paired set of problems here, where the system isn't responding to what really are sexual assaults and is over-responding to something that, frankly, really shouldn't be thought of or dealt with as a sexual assault.
Does this surprise you, Edwin?
Well, yeah. Canada is the only country in the world that frames HIV non-disclosure as sexual assault, and it's really problematic. So, the international guidance is that harm itself, that the harm of having HIV is the thing that should be prosecuted. So, Canada, first of all, stands out. Although there are a number of jurisdictions that prosecute potential or perceived exposure rather than actual harm. Canada stands out for doing that, contrary to international guidance, and certainly framing non-disclosure as aggravated sexual assault in most cases is really problematic.
Do these laws work?
Well, if we look at sexual assault laws, how difficult is it in Canada for a woman to have someone charged and fully prosecuted for sexual assault? Less than 50% of cases that move forward end in a conviction. So if we're having challenges around just our sexual assault laws and them protecting women, how do we have a situation where someone living with HIV is so quickly criminalized and charged and leading to overrepresentation in terms of prosecutions?
Do you think that at the heart of this is the stigma of HIV?
Well, it's
a huge driver.
It's clear. There's a moral. It's a moral panic, and
when you say moral panic, what do you mean?
So there's this idea that there's something about HIV that is so different, so special, so, compared to any other communicable disease, compared to any other sexually transmitted infection, that is, it has all of these additional moral layers added to it. That there's the judgment, there's the fact that, it's associated, or it was originally associated with acts and practices that are seen as not normal. And so that, and then the prosecutions and the media reporting can actually perpetuate that stigma. That's really, it's this vicious circle, to be honest. But you also asked earlier, whether do these laws work? And there have been a number of studies that have looked at this, particularly in the United States, where they actually have some states with HIV-specific criminal laws and some without. And the studies show that they, at the best, they make absolutely no difference at all in terms of people's behavior or in terms of HIV transmission rates. They make no difference at all. But what they also show is that they appear to be doing more harm than good in terms of making people living with HIV, as has already been discussed, afraid to talk about HIV to their healthcare providers, making people who are at particularly high risk of HIV and who may want to engage with healthcare, get tested, think twice about whether that's actually a really good idea. And we have that evidence from the US and from Canada, because these are the two countries, other than Russia, that are the countries that have prosecuted more people with HIV than anywhere else. So they don't do any good, and we would argue they actually do a lot more harm than good.
But shouldn't there be a penalty if somebody does have HIV and they don't disclose it and they place their partner at harm? Shouldn't there be a penalty for that?
So I think there's a majority opinion, and the international guidance that has been mentioned would say, in circumstances where someone actually transmits the virus to a sexual partner because they didn't disclose and intended to do so, then that would be the relatively rare case where it might be appropriate to use the criminal law. But when we compare what that sort of ideal, fairly limited scope of the criminal law is to where we are in Canada now, with this very broad application, I think there's plenty of room for improvement for Canada to pull back the scope of criminalization to something that looks like what is actually internationally recommended as the appropriate limit. And this is why getting the criminal justice system to understand the science about HIV transmission is really, really important, because as we said before, at the moment under the law, in theory, you have a duty to disclose when there's a realistic possibility of transmission. That's the legal test that's used. But in practice, how that's being interpreted is not being well informed by the science. And we're prosecuting people in a whole slew of cases where there's even no risk of transmission. And as Edwin has pointed out, and the examples Natisha has pointed out, it's doing a lot of harm along the way in people's lives, to our efforts at public health more generally, including the HIV prevention things that we know, based on a lot of evidence, really work. Getting people tested, getting people connected to treatment is really important, just from an HIV prevention perspective, aside from the benefits to individual people who might actually have HIV. And yet, this over-criminalization is actually impeding those efforts, even though we have evidence of all the harm it does, and that actually isn't really doing much in terms of HIV prevention. So it seems a little bit foolhardy as public health policy, frankly, to continue down this road, and we really need the criminal justice system to do a pretty substantial rethink.
Well, we mentioned earlier that the federal government plans on reviewing this issue. Final words, we only have a few minutes left. Natisha, what do you want them to change?
We have to remove this issue from the criminal justice system. We need to ramp up public health education. We need to engage people in understanding that HIV is a chronic illness. It is something that people are living long with. They're living healthy lives. And that if we have a law that cannot take into account particular communities, their risks, particularly women, their vulnerabilities, and that your law is actually now creating a situation where you're putting more people at risk. You're putting more people in harm's way, as opposed to a law that's actually protecting women. Sexual assault laws are in place to particularly protect women. And we're actually seeing that is not the case with this particular situation. We need to actually remove this as a criminal justice issue. It is a health issue, it is a health concern, it is something that people need to be treated with respect as we're addressing it. And I think we also have to look at how things like anti-Black racism are coming into play here, how we're being overly prosecuted in the criminal justice system as Black people, and how women are also now in a more vulnerable position.
Edwin, last word.
I think basically the Justice Ministry needs to actually look at what is the purpose of the criminal law, and does it play any role at all with a public health concern like HIV? There's international guidance, there's evidence to show that in fact the criminal law has no, or as Richard said, an extremely limited role to play. And I think it really does need to look at how Canada fits within the rest of the world in terms of standing out, in terms of per capita prosecutions, in terms of such a low bar to evidence, disregarding up-to-date science on risk, and prosecuting risk of harm and not harm, as well as using aggravated sexual assault. There's a litany of problems that need to be addressed, and one would hope that Canada could be a world leader in doing something, basically in doing HIV justice.
Edwin, thank you so much for being here. Richard, Notisha, we appreciate all of you being here to help us understand this issue better. Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.